The sun was just rising over the wide fields of Samuel Rook's farm when he sat at his old wooden desk and typed out the job ad that would change his life forever. He had been farming alone for years since his father passed away and his siblings had moved to the cities. The land stretched far and wide with golden crops swaying in the wind and fences in need of repair. Samuel was a strong man, but the seasons had grown heavier on him and he could no longer tend every acre alone. So he posted a notice across the local networks and even extended it to the off-world job exchange that many farmers had begun to use. The ad was simple. Help wanted on Earth Farm, fair pay, food and lodging included. He expected a couple of tired drifters or maybe local boys looking for work. Nothing more. 2 days passed before anything unusual happened. Samuel was finishing his work in the barn when he saw a strange light in the evening sky. He wiped his brow and squinted. A shuttle descended just beyond the tree line, sleek and scarred from travel. From it stepped 5 tall figures draped in worn cloaks. They walked slowly toward the farmstead, carrying little more than satchels and the heavy weight of weariness on their faces. Samuel's heart pounded, for he knew they were not human. Their posture was different. Their skin carried colors and markings unfamiliar, and their eyes shone in shades not found on Earth. They stopped at the edge of his yard as if afraid to come closer. One of them stepped forward, her voice soft yet carrying a strange accent that bent the English words into unusual shapes. She said they had seen his ad and asked if he truly had need of workers. Samuel, still gripping the handle of his pitchfork, asked them who they were and why they came all this way. The woman lowered her hood, revealing silver hair and deep violet eyes that spoke of long journeys and heavier losses. She said they were widows from a war that had torn through their colony and left them without homes or families. All 5 had lost their husbands in the same campaign, soldiers sent to fight in battles that were never theirs to win. Samuel looked at them in silence, unsure whether to believe or to send them away. He had heard stories of off-world wanderers seeking refuge on Earth, but never had he expected them to land right on his farm. Their clothes were torn, their hands rough, their eyes begging for mercy more than for money. They did not come as beggars of coin, but as souls who had nowhere else to go. They had chosen his farm because it was far from the noise of the cities where aliens were often turned away. Here in the quiet countryside they had hoped a man might listen. He asked them why they thought they could work on a human farm when the soil, the crops, even the tools were foreign to them. Another widow, taller than the rest with scars running along her arms, stepped forward and said they would learn. She said they did not ask for comfort, only shelter and the chance to work with their hands. Her voice trembled as she added that if he turned them away, they had nowhere else to go. Samuel's chest tightened as he listened. He thought of his father, who had once told him that a farm was not just about crops, but about people. He thought of the long nights when he sat alone at his table with no one to share his bread. He looked again at the 5 figures standing in the fading light, their faces lined with grief but also carrying a spark of stubborn will to live. At last he nodded slowly and told them they could stay for the night in the old guest house near the orchard. Tomorrow he would decide if they could truly work his land. The widows bowed their heads in gratitude, their cloaks fluttering in the wind as they walked toward the small house. Samuel stood watching them disappear into the shadows, his mind heavy with questions. Who were these women really? And why had fate dropped them at his doorstep? He knew one thing with certainty. The job ad he had posted for simple farm help had brought him something far stranger than he had ever imagined, and his quiet life was about to change forever. The morning came with the sound of roosters calling across the farm, and Samuel rose earlier than usual because his thoughts had not allowed him to sleep much. He kept thinking about the 5 widows resting in the old guest house and whether he had made the right choice letting them stay the night. The farm had always been a place of hard work and quiet days, not a sanctuary for strangers from the stars. As he walked to the guest house carrying a basket of bread and water, he told himself he would be firm. He would learn who they were, and if they could truly be trusted. When he knocked on the door, there was no hesitation, and one by one they stepped out into the morning light. Without the cloaks, they looked even more otherworldly, each different in color and build, yet all carrying the same tired sadness in their eyes. The one with silver hair, who had spoken first, introduced herself as Leora and said she would speak for the group if he allowed it. She named the others as well, though their names sounded strange on Samuel's tongue, and he struggled to repeat them. They stood in a line, heads lowered slightly, waiting for his judgment. He told them that life on a farm was not easy, that it required long hours, rough hands, and patience with soil that did not always give back what was planted. Leora nodded and said they knew hardship, and that work was better than wandering. She told him more of their story then, how their colony had been erased by warlords and their families slaughtered in raids that spared only those who could flee. With no husbands and no homes, they had taken the first chance to leave their system and found their way to Earth through a refugee transport. The cities had been cold to them, suspicious and harsh, and when they saw his job posting, they believed maybe a small farm far from the noise might give them a chance to breathe. Samuel listened with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Deep inside, he felt the stir of pity, but also the sharp edge of fear. He did not know what kind of enemies might follow them, or whether housing aliens could bring the authorities down on his land. Yet he saw how they looked at him not as a master or employer, but as the last door they dared knock on. He told them they could stay and work, but he gave them conditions. They would earn their keep with sweat, they would follow his rules, and they would bring no trouble to his farm. The widows all nodded, relief washing across their features, and for the first time Samuel thought he saw a faint smile cross one of their lips. The day's work began almost at once. Samuel led them to the fields where the wheat needed cutting and the soil needed tilling. At first the widows were clumsy with the tools, unused to the weight of iron scythes or the resistance of Earth's dirt beneath the plow. They dropped things, they strained their arms, they stumbled across furrows. Samuel shook his head, thinking he might have made a mistake. Yet as the hours passed, he noticed small, strange things. One of the women pressed her hand to the ground and pointed to a patch of soil that looked dry, but underneath held hidden moisture. Another carried a bundle twice as heavy as Samuel could manage and did it without a grunt. Another seemed to know which plants were weak and which would thrive, as if she could read the life within them. These were not ordinary workers, and though they struggled, they carried gifts that slowly revealed themselves. By midday, Samuel found himself studying them with a mix of awe and caution. He brought them water and bread and sat nearby while they ate in silence. He realized they were not helpless refugees, but survivors of a war that had forced them to learn skills he could not imagine. When they looked up at him, he saw no deceit, only a desperate hope that he might not cast them away. He finished his meal and stood, telling them that if they kept this effort, he might just have the best harvest of his life. The words were plain, but he saw how they brightened the faces of the widows. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Samuel sat on his porch, watching them return to the guest house. They moved slower now, weary from the day, but he noticed how they carried themselves with a dignity that hardship could not erase. He thought about what the neighbors might say if they saw alien widows working his land. He thought about the authorities who might not care for explanations. But as he listened to the quiet rustle of the fields and the laughter he thought he heard faintly from the guest house, he also felt something new, a sense that perhaps this farm was no longer just his own, but the beginning of something larger. The days turned into weeks, and the farm began to change in ways Samuel had never seen before. The 5 alien widows rose before dawn and worked until the last light faded, their strange talents weaving themselves into the rhythm of the land. Samuel had worried at first that they would slow him down or bring more burden than help, but soon he realized the opposite. The soil seemed richer under their care, the crops grew straighter and taller, and even the animals responded differently, as if sensing the gentle yet firm presence of new caretakers. The widow with the scarred arms, whom Samuel came to know as Soraya, proved to be stronger than any farmhand he had ever hired. She carried bales of hay with ease and lifted beams that usually took 3 men to move. The one named Illith had a sense for water, and guided Samuel to places where underground streams flowed. With her guidance, he dug new wells that never ran dry. Another, called Marin, moved among the animals with uncanny calm, soothing the horses when storms rolled in and keeping the cattle from panicking when thunder struck. Each woman found her place as if the farm had been waiting for them all along. Samuel tried not to show how impressed he was. He had been a farmer his whole life, and he took pride in hard work done with human hands. But when he saw how quickly the land flourished under their touch, he could not deny that their presence was a blessing. Still, he kept his guard, for he knew the world beyond his fields would not look kindly on what he had chosen. Neighbors began to notice the changes as well. When Samuel went into town for supplies, he caught whispers trailing behind him. Some said he had taken on strange workers. Others claimed he was harboring outlaws from the stars. A few laughed that his crops had doubled overnight because he must have struck a deal with off-world sorcery. Samuel ignored the gossip, but deep inside he worried it would not remain harmless for long. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Samuel sat with the widows around a fire near the barn. He had prepared stew and bread, and though their tastes were not the same, they ate with gratitude. For the first time, they spoke more openly about their past. Leora told of the world they had lost, a colony rich with forests and rivers that had been burned in the war. Soraya described her husband, a soldier who never returned, and the vow she had made to survive so his memory would not vanish. Marin spoke of children she once hoped to have but never did. Their voices carried sorrow but also a quiet strength that made Samuel fall silent. He realized then that they were not simply widows seeking shelter, but warriors of life who refused to bow to despair. The farm grew not only in harvest, but in spirit. Laughter sometimes rose from the guest house at night, soft and hesitant at first, but growing stronger as days passed. Samuel found himself walking past the orchard and hearing songs in alien tongues, melodies that lifted into the stars. Yet shadows gathered too. One morning, as Samuel loaded grain into the cart for market, he noticed a neighbor watching from across the road. The man's eyes were narrow and his lips tight. Later that day in town, Samuel overheard two men talking that aliens had no place in Earth's countryside, and that someone should report the farmer who thought he could play savior. Samuel clenched his fists but said nothing. He knew trouble was drawing nearer. Still, when he returned home and saw the widows tending the fields, he felt a resolve harden in his chest. They had given his land new life, and in return he had given them safety. He understood that their presence was no accident. Perhaps fate had chosen his small farm as the place where broken souls could begin again. The thought frightened him, but it also gave him strength. For the first time in years, Samuel did not feel alone, and though whispers spread beyond his fences, he knew that inside them, something rare was taking root. Something neither war nor prejudice could easily destroy. The summer sun rose heavy and hot over the farm, and Samuel felt the weight of eyes on him, even when he worked alone in the fields. Rumors had grown stronger in town, and whispers had turned into accusations. People asked why his harvest was richer than theirs, why his animals thrived when others struggled, why strange figures were sometimes glimpsed near his land at dusk. The truth was that Samuel no longer cared what they thought, yet he knew the moment was coming when they would force him to defend his choices. The widows continued their work with steady patience. They repaired fences, planted new rows, and even built a small shelter for the chickens that Samuel had long neglected to replace. Their skills amazed him, but their presence drew questions from neighbors who rode past on horseback or slowed their trucks when passing his road. The air was thick with suspicion. One morning, a black vehicle rolled up the path to his farmhouse, and a man stepped out in a neat uniform carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as an agricultural inspector and said complaints had reached the department that Samuel was employing unregistered off-worlders. Samuel's jaw tightened, and he invited the man to walk the property. As they passed through the fields, the inspector asked pointed questions about his workers, their origins, their legal status. Samuel gave calm but firm replies, saying they were helpers paid in food and shelter. Nothing illegal in that. The inspector frowned and made notes on his clipboard, but Samuel did not flinch. At the barn, the widows were working, their faces lined with unease as they sensed the stranger's intent. Leora stepped forward to greet him, but Samuel raised a hand and told her to continue her tasks. He did not want them to face questioning like criminals. The inspector left after 2 hours with a warning that if Samuel did not register his workers properly, there could be penalties. Samuel knew the warning was only the beginning. In town that week, the stares grew sharper. A few men laughed loudly when he passed, calling him alien lover. Women whispered about danger and disease. Yet others looked with envy at the bounty of his goods laid out in the market stalls. The contrast between admiration and hatred pulled the town into an uneasy tension. Samuel sold his grain quickly but heard the mutters that it was unnatural. He returned home with a storm inside him. That night, as the widows shared supper with him, he told them of the inspector's visit. Their faces fell into silence, and one of them whispered that trouble always followed them wherever they went. Samuel shook his head and told them that trouble was part of life, but on his farm they would face it together. His words were plain, but they carried a weight the widows felt deeply. They bowed their heads not in submission but in respect for the human farmer who stood with them when no one else would. Days later, the first true sign of hostility arrived. A fence was cut near the pasture and several animals scattered into the fields. Samuel found the tracks of men and saw ashes where a torch had burned the ground. He did not need to guess who was behind it. Fear had turned to anger among some of his neighbors. He patched the fence with Saraya's help, and together they drove the cattle back inside. His hands shook with fury, but his voice was steady when he told the widows that no one would drive them from his land. They looked at him with eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow because they knew danger was coming. The farm continued to thrive, but shadows lengthened around it. At night, Samuel sometimes saw distant lights near the road where men watched but did not approach. The widows moved cautiously, no longer singing in the orchard, no longer laughing by the fire. Yet even as unease grew stronger, Samuel felt his resolve deepen. This land was his inheritance, his duty, and now also their sanctuary. If the world wanted to test him, it would find him ready. The night of the attack came without warning. Samuel had gone to bed after a long day of tending fields and mending tools. Yet something in the stillness felt wrong. The crickets were silent, and even the cattle shifted restlessly in the pasture. A sudden crash jolted him awake, and he smelled smoke drifting through his window. He leapt from bed and pulled on his boots before running out into the yard. Flames licked at the edge of his wheat fields, and shadows moved along the fence line. Shouts filled the air, angry voices calling him traitor, alien sympathizer, fool for harboring outsiders. He grabbed the shotgun from the porch, though he had no wish to fire it, and sprinted toward the fire. The widows were already there, their cloaks thrown aside as they fought to beat down the flames with water and soil. Samuel's breath caught as he saw how swiftly they moved, their bodies trained for survival in ways no farmer could match. Saraya charged into the blaze without fear, hauling smoldering beams away with bare hands. Hilith pressed her palms to the earth and drew water from hidden pockets below, spilling it onto the fire until steam rose thick as fog. Marin whistled sharply and the panicked cattle stilled, gathering together instead of trampling the fences. Leora shouted orders in her native tongue, and the others obeyed with perfect precision. In moments, Samuel realized he was not looking at helpless widows but hardened survivors of war. The men who had set the fire stepped closer, carrying bats and clubs, their faces twisted with rage. Samuel recognized some of them as neighbors, men who had once shared drinks with his father, men who now looked at him as if he were the enemy. One spat on the ground and shouted that Earth was for humans and that Samuel was a disgrace. He swung his club toward the nearest widow, but she moved like lightning, catching his wrist and twisting until he cried out. Another charged at Samuel, and Samuel raised his shotgun, though he fired it into the air instead of at flesh. The thunderous blast froze the attackers for a heartbeat, and in that moment the widows struck with precision, disarming their assailants without taking lives. They fought not with hatred but with practiced skill, moving as one, protecting the farm and each other. The fire was brought under control, but smoke hung heavy over the fields. The attackers fled into the night, leaving behind curses and threats that this was not over. Samuel stood among the widows, breathing hard, sweat running down his face, his heart pounding not only from fear but from the shocking realization of what he had seen. These women had carried themselves as workers, gentle in their labors, humble in their gratitude, yet tonight their true nature had been revealed. They were warriors forced into widowhood, soldiers who had lost everything yet still refused to be broken. When dawn came, the damage to the crops was clear, but the farm still stood. The widows gathered around Samuel with quiet expressions. Leora spoke softly, saying they had not wished to reveal what they were, for they feared he would cast them out. If he knew they had once been part of battle. Samuel shook his head and told them he cared not for the past they carried. What mattered was what they chose now, and they had chosen to defend his home as fiercely as their own. His words left them, silent until Saraya placed a scarred hand on his shoulder and said that perhaps for the first time since the war, they felt safe. But Samuel knew safety was only an illusion. The attack had shown that hatred was growing and that sooner or later more would come, stronger and more determined. He looked across his land, scarred by fire yet still alive, and swore to himself that no power would drive these women away. They had become part of the soil, part of the air, part of the farm itself. Together they would endure whatever storm came next. The days after the attack were tense but alive with purpose as Samuel and the widows worked together to rebuild the farm stronger than before. Every sunrise brought with it a chorus of birds and the rustle of wheat in the wind. a gentle reminder that life continued, despite the threat that lingered like a shadow at the edge of the fields. Soraya moved through the barn with quiet authority, showing Samuel how to reinforce the beams so that they could withstand both fire and force. Ilith planted new water channels that flowed beneath the soil, hidden yet powerful, a secret reservoir ready to protect the land when danger came. Marin repaired the fences with a precision that Samuel had never seen, hammering the posts deep into the ground while whispering to the animals to calm them. Leora walked among the crops, touching the plants with a soft hand as if coaxing them to grow faster, and Samuel realized that even their labor carried the grace of someone who had survived more than the average human could imagine. Samuel's mind could not stop wandering to the night of the attack and the skill the widows had shown. He remembered how their eyes had burned with intensity, how their movements had been coordinated without words, how each of them had been ready to give everything to protect him and his home. He knew then that these women were not ordinary farm workers, not ordinary refugees, but beings who carried the weight of battle in their bones and fire in their hearts. The thought both frightened and thrilled him, for he had opened his doors out of simple kindness. Yet now he realized that kindness had invited a force unlike anything the galaxy had seen into his quiet corner of the world. As the week passed, word of Samuel's farm began to spread among the surrounding towns and settlements. Curiosity drew people closer, some skeptical, some hopeful, and a few cautious observers who lingered at the edges of his property without stepping forward. Samuel found himself explaining nothing and letting the widows act naturally, for their presence was explanation enough. Villagers whispered about the strange beauty of the women, their movements graceful yet commanding, their eyes holding stories no one dared to ask. Samuel noticed the subtle ways they protected each other, how a glance could communicate strategy, how silence could hold more meaning than words ever could. Each day the farm grew stronger, the fields healthier, the fences sturdier, and Samuel began to understand that he had not just hired workers, he had gained guardians who would not hesitate to fight for what they loved. Then the night came when the sky turned red and a low hum vibrated through the air. Samuel felt the hairs on his neck rise and the widows moved with a speed and focus that made him step back. In the distance, a massive ship descended, sleek and black against the crimson horizon. It was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen, a vessel that seemed built for speed and destruction, rather than diplomacy. The widows formed a silent line before him, their eyes scanning the ground and the sky, their bodies tense with readiness. Samuel's heart raced, and yet he felt a strange calm, knowing that he was not alone, that the people he had sheltered were not merely survivors but warriors who had mastered survival in ways he could only dream of. The ship landed in the middle of his fields, shaking the earth beneath their feet. A hatch opened and figures emerged, taller and stronger than any human, clad in armor that gleamed even under the faint moonlight. Samuel saw the determination in their eyes and realized that this confrontation would decide more than just the fate of his farm. The widows moved forward as one, a living wall of strength and strategy, ready to face whatever threat had come from the stars. Samuel swallowed hard and stepped beside them, shotgun in hand, though he knew the true strength lay not in him, but in the women who had chosen to stand by his side. The first figure raised its weapon, and the silence before the storm was absolute, the farm holding its breath as destiny approached with the roar of engines and the weight of vengeance. The tension that had built across Samuel's farm reached a crescendo as the alien figures advanced with deliberate precision, their steps silent yet heavy with intent. The widows never flinched, each of them radiating a confidence that made Samuel's pulse pound in his ears. He gripped his weapon, though he knew deep inside that it was their strength and skill that would decide the outcome. The first alien raised its weapon, a long staff that hummed with energy, but before it could strike, Soraya moved with a speed that blurred her figure. She collided, with the alien knocking it to the ground with a force that seemed impossible for a single human body. Ilith and Marin followed immediately, surrounding the remaining enemies in a precise formation that Samuel had never imagined. They moved like predators, coordinating without words, like 5 parts of one unstoppable force. Leora stood behind him, her eyes glowing softly as she muttered something under her breath. The air thickened around them, and Samuel felt a sudden surge of energy ripple through the field as if the land itself had joined the fight. The aliens retaliated with blasts of energy that carved through the soil, but the widows anticipated each attack, deflecting, dodging, and countering with a grace that was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Samuel realized that every move they made was not only to protect him, but also to reclaim the peace that he had offered them. Unasked, their skills were honed over years of survival across systems where mercy was weakness, and strength was the only law in the chaos. Samuel felt a surge of admiration mixed with fear. For the sheer force that stood before him, he had never known humanity could be matched in ferocity by beings so seemingly delicate, yet deadly in action. He realized that kindness had forged an alliance that could withstand anything. The widows' combined strategy forced the aliens into retreat. Each blow landed with precision. Each movement predicted the enemy's next strike, and Samuel felt a strange pride that these women had chosen his farm to protect their sanctuary. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and the field became a battlefield of shadows and energy. The aliens' attempts to gain ground faltered against the coordination and strength of the widows. Samuel could see the wear in their bodies, yet the fire in their eyes never dimmed. He understood then that this was not just defense. This was a statement to the galaxy that humanity's compassion was never weakness, and those who underestimated it paid with fear and respect. The alien leader, a towering figure whose armor shimmered with alien symbols, finally raised its hands in a gesture that Samuel had learned from old human conflicts was surrender. The widows held their positions but allowed a pause as the threat became clear. The aliens retreated toward their ship, leaving behind a field marked with scorched earth but intact structures, a silent declaration that the farm had withstood the impossible, and its guardians had proven invincible. As the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, Samuel walked among the widows, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and awe. Soraya tended to minor injuries with her precise hands. Ilith checked the water channels, making sure the new systems held. Marin repaired fences already scarred by energy blasts. Leora touched the crops, as if reminding them to grow stronger after surviving fear and destruction. Samuel realized that these women were more than allies. They were protectors who had changed his life forever. Their presence had transformed the farm from a simple plot of land into a symbol of resilience and unity. The villagers, who had watched from afar, now approached not with fear, but with respect, knowing that this was a place where humanity and its allies could thrive even against forces that seemed unbeatable. The widows gathered around Samuel, and in their own quiet way communicated that this farm, this land, and this man had become part of something larger than survival. It was the embodiment of courage, trust, and unity across species. Samuel smiled, knowing that the galaxy might never understand the bond forged here, but it did not matter, because here on this soil, he had found something that transcended fear. The farm was safe, the widows were strong, and the future seemed wide open with possibilities. The hum of life returned to the fields. The crops swayed gently. The animals grazed peacefully, and Samuel felt a deep, unshakable connection to the women who had turned his act of kindness into a fortress against the cosmos. And in that moment he knew that no challenge, no enemy, and no darkness could ever shake what had been built here. The farm was quiet now, but not empty. The alien widows stood among the crops, their presence serene yet commanding, as if the very air around them had been infused with purpose. Samuel walked slowly, between the rows, feeling the soil beneath his boots and the wind brushing against his face. The sun rose higher, revealing the scars of battle but also the strength that had emerged from it. He looked at Soraya, Ilith, Marin, Leora, and knew that the universe had brought them together not by chance, but by necessity, their bond, unspoken, yet unbreakable. It was forged in danger and solidified in trust. The villagers who had once feared the unknown now came forward with awe in their eyes and gratitude in their hearts, for the farm had become more than a home. It was a symbol of resilience, and proof that compassion could summon allies in the most unlikely forms. Samuel remembered the moment the widows had first appeared at his doorstep begging for shelter, and now he realized that their arrival had changed everything, not just for him but for the entire region. The widows moved gracefully, tending to the animals, repairing the fences, checking the water channels, Their eyes held wisdom from worlds far beyond the comprehension of any human mind. Yet they carried themselves with humility and purpose. A distant hum announced the approach of a scout ship. Yet the widows did not flinch. They simply nodded to Samuel as if acknowledging that the world outside had its own rules. But here, on this farm, their law was one of protection. And courage the villagers watched as the widows demonstrated feats of skill that defied imagination. Bending metal with their hands, lifting heavy machinery with ease, and coordinating every action with precision and care. Samuel felt pride swell in his chest, not because of power but because of unity. The widows had taught him that strength was not only measured in force but in loyalty, in the courage to stand for what is right and the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The scout ship hovered above, then retreated, sensing the aura of control emanating from the land below. And Samuel realized that the farm had become a beacon of deterrence, a living testament that those who underestimated humanity and its allies did so at their own peril. Evening approached and the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and purple. Casting long shadows across the fields, the widows gathered around Samuel, sharing stories in their own alien tongue. And yet he understood every nuance, the laughter, the warnings, the plans for the future. It was a language of trust and connection that transcended species. The crops swayed gently under the breeze and the animals moved freely, as if celebrating their safety. Samuel finally took a deep breath, closing his eyes, feeling the warmth of sun and earth and friendship wrapping around him like a shield. He knew that the galaxy would continue to challenge them with dangers and enemies. But here on this farm, they had learned that courage multiplied by unity was unstoppable, that kindness could summon strength unimaginable, and that life itself was worth defending with every ounce of energy one could muster. As night fell, the stars appeared in the sky, glittering like distant promises. Samuel looked at the widows standing vigilant, their eyes reflecting the starlight. And he knew that the story of this farm would travel far across galaxies, and that the echoes of this day would be remembered not for destruction, but for the triumph of spirit and alliance. He smiled, knowing that whatever came next, they were ready for it together. They had turned a simple farm into a fortress of hope and courage, and the galaxy would never forget that humans and their allies could stand unyielding against the tides of fear and aggression. The wind whispered through the fields, carrying the quiet assurance that this was only the beginning, that more adventures awaited, more challenges to face, and more victories to claim. But tonight they could rest knowing that they had proven themselves and the farm had become legend. The end.